Hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Isabel McLaren and I will be the moderator for today. I would like to thank our sponsor Fibro for making this webinar possible. So without any further ado, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming our speaker, Dr. Jean-Pierre Biancourt, who will be speaking about the three key principles of biosecurity, how to make them work for you. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Jean-Pierre Vaillancourt. I'm a professor at the University of Montreal at the College of Veterinary Medicine. I got my DVM in 1983 and a master's degree in clinical sciences at the same institution. And then I got my PhD at the University of Minnesota. Since then, I've been around as a professor at the Ontario Veterinary College, University of Guelph, at North Carolina State University, and I've been an invited professor in Mexico and in France as well, in Toulouse in particular. And my area of expertise is biosecurity, epidemiology, and control of infectious diseases. And essentially, I've been doing research on this since way back in the 20th century. And I'm basically focusing on this as well in terms of training, and in particular regarding compliance, because you'll see that it's one major issue that we have. So first, let me mention that what we're going to talk about, these principles are certainly not new. They come from centuries of experience where people have figured out really risk factors. And we know them in poultry. In poultry, we know that birds, whether they're, I highlight them now, whether they are wild birds or other domestic birds, having sites with several species on it. Water is a source, is a nutrient, but it's also a source of contamination. Any visitors, any movement on a farm with equipment or not, all these factors, dead birds, you see the list there, are playing a role in the transmission of diseases. And one in particular is the farm density. And I'm not talking here about the number of birds per square meter, but much more the number of production sites per square kilometer. That by itself is a risk because it allows more traffic on farm, and we'll see that in a moment. Essentially, we're trying to control infectious diseases. So what we're trying to do is to break the chain of infection. You can see it in the upper right corner. To have an infectious disease, you need an agent, of course, or several. They need to be somewhere, to be in a reservoir. They need to be able to get out of there and be transmitted to a susceptible host. And so this is essentially a probability game. It's a little bit as if you get a disease if when you're playing with dice, you get 2 times 6. Well, if we would like to actually increase our odds of getting a disease, there's 2 ways to go at it. Either you play with more dice or you play more often. And that essentially, these dices are risk factors. And some of them, by the way, are so risky that it's as if you have 6s all over their surfaces. And playing, you play when you don't have good compliance when it comes to biosecurity measures. So what we're going to talk about is the measures that lead to the problem and how we can improve compliance. What I put there is a formula. I'm not going to go in details there, but I want to remind people that let's say we have a biosecurity breach or a risk factor that may lead only once out of 1,000 events to disease transmission. Just once out of 1,000 events. That seems like not a big risk. But if that breach of biosecurity, for example, occurs once a week, then what this formula is telling us is that we have over 5% chance of having disease occurrence. And so it's very important to focus not only on having the right measures, because we know they work, we have experience on that, um, but also to make sure that it's applied properly. So here you have a lot of examples um, of with avian influenza, where you have, for example, risk factor visitors 8 times more at risk of causing transmission of avian influenza. Clothing, boots, basically, that's another study, but also related to visitors, 7 times more at risk. Sharing equipment is a big risk for a lot of diseases, including avian influenza. Uh, Birds, of course, breeders, egg layers will be at a greater risk because they are in the field longer. Rendering is a risk factor. If it's well done, it's good, but there's often issues there. So you see, you can have like rats, any kind of wildlife. We already have a lot of data showing that these factors are risks, and we have ways of dealing with them. That could be insects as well, darting beetles, flies. We know it's a risk of disease transmission, including avian influenza, and transportation. I'll give you a couple of examples there. First, in France, very recently, the French had over 480 outbreaks of H5N8. And when they looked back at the main risk factors, what came out really on top was duck movements, the way they moved birds from one site to another site. These vehicles moving animals was the #1 risk. Then you had the regional density. They had a lot of duck production farm in the area, and that was also a big risk. And then the density of waterways. But it's really transportation that was a big deal. And we've seen that in Canada as well. For example, with infectious laryngotracheitis in the Niagara Peninsula. This is a study I did because they had that infectious disease every 4 to 5 years. It would then go away after several outbreaks. And so they wanted to know, what leads to this. And so we looked at farms with the problem, and we went to see neighbors who had birds at risk at the same time, but they didn't have the problem. And what came out as very significant was vaccination crew. If they needed to have an outside vaccination crew to come in and vaccinate for whatever reason, could have been for bronchitis or something like that, they were about 13 times more at risk of getting ILT. And if they needed to have an outside company handle their used litter, so having somebody coming from outside to take care of the litter, they were about 8 times more at risk of getting ILT. So transportation is a big deal, and it's particularly a big deal when we have high regional density. And that's true not only for viruses, it's true also for bacteria. As you can see it here with Salmonella, E. coli, as well as known viruses. You have an odds ratio over 1, so it's significant higher risk if farms are within a kilometer of one another compared to over a kilometer. And that is not only because the wind may play a role. A lot of people think, oh, well, ILT, for example, we know it could be potentially spread over a distance maybe of a kilometer or so. But avian influenza, quite frankly, we don't have a lot of evidence that it travels so easily through the wind, but it does a very good job with mechanical vectors like equipment, people's clothing, vehicles. Wildlife can contribute as carriers and stuff like that. So that density may involve the wind as a factor, but very often, if you think it's the wind, it's actually something else. It's that traffic that we get on farm. So how do we react to that? Well, there's different levels of biosecurity. You have the national, state level, provincial, depending on your organization in your country. But when you get to that level, it also becomes political. So I'm not going to go there. I'm going to focus on the farm level type biosecurity, but I'm going to stress two aspects. Outside people, allied companies coming to the farm, utilities companies, whatever. So these people are outsiders, and sometimes they don't have the proper training. We need to be aware of that. And the regional perspective. If you work within an integrated system, the way I put it is that if you want to hit the bullseye, you need to look to have a well-balanced approach, looking at the farm level biosecurity, the company level biosecurity, and the regional. The regional may involve other companies, independent growers. At one point in some regions, when you have a high poultry production density in a region, you'll see that you need to communicate. You need to talk and organize. So we're trying to break that chain of infection. If we know the risk factors, we also know how to do it. Sanitation will help to remove the agent. Pest control, and by pest, I mean it in a large way. That include managing people to remove reservoirs. You have, of course, the traffic control of people, equipment, so that there's no transmission to the susceptible host. And of course, you have measures like all in, all out, downtime, and all that, which work at removing the susceptible host in some cases, which is very useful. You'll see in the lower right corner, I mentioned communication. You'll see why I say that in a second. Because here it is. Here you have the three major principles, basic principle of biosecurity. In fact, the first two, reducing and separating, these two principles will cover all the measures you can think of to put in place on a farm. And that's exactly what they're doing right now with the coronavirus situation in humans. And these principles go way back to sacred texts, whether it's the Bible, the Quran, or any other sacred text, old documents, others. We find these principles there. So it's not as if we've invented anything. We just not often apply what we know works. So what works? First is reducing the sources of contamination. So to do that, so essentially we're talking about cleaning, disinfecting, removing organic material. If you have a ton of manure, that's a lot of organic material with potentially coronavirus in it, that would affect poultry because there's some like that. And so you need to remove that. You need to dispose of it properly. And then you need to decontaminate the site. So washing and disinfection, we'll see that. That's the first principle. We need to reduce any potential sources of contamination. And then we need to separate healthy birds from any source of contamination. That's why, for example, if you have a shower in, shower out setup, what's the idea there is the shower, to be effective, it has to be the transition between the outside and the inside where you have the animals. That's the principle. You're trying to separate. You need to zone. So, and that's why right now in humans, they're saying stay at home, right? They're trying to separate people to make sure that we create distance. So we're just applying this old principle that you can find in texts that are over 1,000, 2,000 years old. And the last one, that's more modern in terms of principle, is communication organization. Because if you are in a high farm density region, on-farm biosecurity alone will not prevent you to have problems. You cannot biosecure a region by just focusing on on-farm biosecurity, one farm at a time. You need to have a regional perspective. So we'll talk about this towards the end. So if we look at cleaning, basically, what we're talking is dry cleaning, which is removing any organic material as much as possible, removing litter, feed, stuff like that. You disassemble, you remove, you dust and all that. Now, this is a good time to do insect control. When you have an infestation, this is something you do as the birds are being sent to slaughter. You want to act as quickly as possible doing that. And then you need to clean. Clean with a proper detergent, and you need to apply it correctly. That includes having proper contact time. That's critical for the detergent, and you'll see also for the disinfectant. So you need to have a good contact time. And here I put less than 60 degrees. If you can have warm water, it's better than cold water. But be careful. Too hot is not better, because if you exceed 65 degrees, for example, you may actually cook organic material that's left over, and you help create biofilms on surfaces by doing that. So you have to be careful there. Hot water, yes, but not too hot. If you can do pressure washing, that's good. But then again, we don't want to exaggerate, because mainly if you have wood or even concrete, if you have very high pressure washer, you can actually create basically a cut in wood in particular, but basically create crevices that will allow bacteria, viruses, and all that to nest in there. So you want to be very careful about high pressure, although it's very good to do it properly. And then what's critical is to let it dry, because if you don't let it dry and you apply immediately after a disinfectant, even if you use the proper concentration in the field, you apply that disinfectant on a wet surface, you're diluting the disinfectant, and so you're not going to get the result you expect. So you need to make sure that it's dried. Then you apply the disinfectant, sufficient amount so that it will not dry within seconds. You'll see why I say that. And then you let it dry. The last step would be to control rats, mice, and all that. This is something that you can do before, but you certainly want to take the opportunity to do that eventually before bringing another flock, and then again do insect control. So I mentioned contact time. This is a study that looked at the importance of contact time for disinfectant. And you see in blue, you have the drying time. Typically, if we just apply a minimal amount of the product in the proper concentration. But the other column in red looks at the time needed in minutes to actually achieve good disinfection. And you can see that for very good products, bleach, quartz, peroxide, phenols, these are all good products. But if they don't have enough contact time, it's not going to be a very efficacious disinfection. And that's true also for the contamination of boots, for example. You'll see that in a second. So we did a study in Ontario, in Canada, and we did this litter removal followed by dry sanitation, wet sanitation with a detergent, and with a disinfectant. The take-home message on this slide is that to really have a significant drop in the number of pathogens on the surface, we were cleaning wood and cleaning cement floors. You really need to go to disinfection. You can see in the upper right corner, you can lose basically 2 logs if you disinfect, and that's when you have a significant difference. You lose 100%. You reduce by 100 times actually the contamination if you do disinfection. If you just clean, that's certainly an essential step. If you don't have a problem on a farm and you elect to just do a dry cleaning, Many people do that. They'll just clean with washing and disinfection once a year, things like that. If you don't have a problem, I can see that. But if you do have a problem, you need to go not only into cleaning and disinfection once, but you'll see that you might need to do it several times. In that study, we'll look at a specific E. coli because we know, for example, with cellulitis in broilers, that we have some strains of E. coli that have developed not only antibiotic resistance, but they have developed also a resistance to disinfect. And in this particular study, you see the bottom line here, to achieve proper disinfection, to be significant with a p-value of less than 0.05, we needed, when we were dealing with wood in particular, to decontaminate wet washing and disinfection after every flock to eventually have a good result. And so when we have a problem like that with a bacteria like E. coli on a farm, it's important to keep in mind that doing a good cleaning and disinfection and all this is good. It might not be sufficient to do it only once. You might need to repeat it, and the growers need to be aware of that. They need to be resilient because that would be an issue. If they try it once and they say it didn't work, well, you need to make sure they did it properly, and then you need to convince them that they may need to repeat this a few times over several flocks to achieve good results. So we want to monitor, right? And it starts with a visual assessment. So if it fails right away, we see a lot of organic material, then we need to review the protocol, how they are doing what they're doing. If it passes, then once a year, it depends, you may want to do bacteriological assessment. And if you get the good results, fine. If not, then you need to look back at your washing and disinfection protocol. The thing is, you need to do the building, the equipment, but often people will neglect the contamination of tractors, the drinkers per se, tillers, fly traps, all sorts of equipment. Dead flies are left there. They can be a source of contamination. Any kind of debris around the building, we need to get rid of that as much as possible. Eric Gonder is the chief veterinarian for a very large US company. And he was saying, this is a man with 40 years of experience, and he was saying that, you know, you need to make sure that the organic material that's left over, because we cannot remove everything absolutely, but it has to be so small that it would be less than, no bigger than a nickel per se, or a small piece of money, and very thin, so that if you apply a disinfectant, detergent is going to soak through it. If you cannot achieve that, then you're going to have a problem. And he was asking the question, well, if you have a fail, do you need to actually condemn employees to redo the whole thing? His point was, that's not the best way to go. So what he's using is either a very bright tape or a spray that will highlight in color, and that's easy to, kind of a vegetable type color, that's easy to remove, okay, so that you don't stain forever the environment. But he says, what I go and do monitoring, I go around, and if I find organic material too big an amount, I'm going to spray it, so that after that, the employees can go and decontaminate specifically wherever I spread. And the other thing is, we do that a few times, and we may realize that it's always the same areas that need to be looked at again. And so that's helpful, because then we can emphasize in the training to put emphasis on this so that we can have success repeatedly. Now, water is important. Water is critical. In North Carolina, in turkey production, they had problems with a disease called poultry mortality syndrome. And they had issues with a cocktail of pathogens. They, at one point, did a trial where they really worked hard on cleaning the water, and on the same farm, separate building, they just did what they normally do, and the difference was spectacular. Even in the absence of disease, feed conversion, uniformity of the flock, everything was better if good quality water was provided to the birds. So obviously, if you have surface water, that's a risk factor. But no matter the origin, you need to make sure that you have a protocol to decontaminate, to sanitize the water. Chlorine is often used where I'm from. And in this case, you want to make sure that you have your oxido reduction potential is high. Because if it's low, and if your pH, for example, is above 7, your chlorine is not going to be very efficacious. So you still put it in the water, but you won't have a good result. And of course, before you start thinking about providing clean water to the birds, you need to make sure that the water lines are in good shape, are well cleaned, at least on a regular basis. Typically, we ask people to do that between flocks. This is one example with peroxide, hydrogen peroxide solution. The point that I want to emphasize here, because there's different ways of doing it, is to, if you have nipple drinkers, you need to activate them somehow so that the product that you put to clean the water lines actually make it down to the mechanism where you have the nipple drinkers. And you need to let that stay for a good 24 hours. And then you flush. Now, if you do have hard water, you may want to use citric acid or any other products to deal with this, because hard water, we're trying to remove biofilms. But if you have hard waters, you're going to have another type of film there, and clogging and issues. So when you clean the water lines, that's the time to make sure that the lines are not going to get more restricted, the size of the pipe, because of the accumulation of minerals. So that's the time to do it. And at the end, of course, you do a good flushing with bleach water, for example, and then just regular water. In particular, if you're going to vaccinate eventually, you don't want to have any disinfectant left over. One quick mention about the pH. You want it less than 7, but you don't want to have extremely acid. Some equipment may be affected if the water you're using is at less than 4 in terms of pH, for example. And so now we have the site. We're trying to protect that site. This is an example with 4 barns. You have a shed. The grower has his house, and there's a dead bird disposal there, not too far. Should be ideally, if you're going to have it, at least 100 meters away, and certainly not in a place so that the people doing the rendering would actually go on the site of the farm to go pick up the dead bird, the dead bird disposal container, because these people can be going to 40 farms in one day, or 40 sites. So they represent quite a bit of a risk. So here's the concept of separation there. It's in 2 zones. You have what we call the control access zone and the restricted access zone. So the control access zone is, if you can put a fence, that's great. But in many cases, either it's not possible or it's too costly. But even if you don't have a fence, you need to identify the place around the barns or where the birds are that you want to control, where you want to say, the vehicles are going to get there, the trucks, it's because we decided they can get in, and not just anybody. And of course, the house of the grower is not part of that, because there's no biosecurity there per se. And the dead bird disposal place is also not part of that control access zone, because you have the rendering truck coming in, and as that truck comes in, will contaminate the place around the container. And so you have the restricted access zone. Well, that's essentially where you find the birds. And you need to have control access points to get in. So that's kind of, if I may use a football analogy, that's the line where you have the goal. If when you pass that line, if the bug can make it over that line, that's a goal for the bug, but it's a defeat for you. So we need to have ways of dealing with it. Um, what we're promoting right now, more and more in North America, is what they call the Danish entrance. So it's a 3-zone entrance. Very often our farms are still with 2 zones and with just a line or a bench in between. And that's okay if that's what it is, but the principles have to be maintained. And that includes in particular in the transition between the outside and the inside. And when going out, it's the same thing. Uh, you want to decontaminate your hands. So the setup you have here, you can see the upper left corner. It's material that's easy to clean, to remove, to disinfect between flocks. But essentially, you have equipment to decontaminate. You have a spray. And then you see the individual has a bench so he can remove his shoes and then move over to the transition zone where he decontaminates his hands. Why it's important? It's because after that, he's going to touch the boots of the farm or the coveralls. And if he does that with hands that might be contaminated, then he's contaminating in particular the boots that are at the level of the birds very often, and that's not good. So whether you put the plastic boots or you have rubber boots from the farm, you need to decontaminate the hands. Now, when you have only a line, what we tell growers is make sure you have alcoholic gel, hydrogel dispenser there so that people can use that to decontaminate their hands. I'll be talking about it in a second. Here it is. We did a study with bird catchers, people who would catch 2,000 to 3,000 birds with their hands. And after that, we tried 4 different protocols. One was just the 70% alcohol-based gel solution. Another one was soap, water, and gel. Another one was a degreasing cream that you see in some garages, plus the gel, or wipes, industrial wipes, and the gel. You have the gel everywhere because where I am located, it's a standard decontamination product. And so we had it in all 4 protocols. Well, first, the good news is when it comes to salmonella, we had here pre-treatment. We had about 40 bird catchers, and some had salmonella on their hands. And after any of the protocols, we could not find salmonella. That doesn't mean it did not exist anymore, but we could no longer detect. So that's really good. Now, the other thing we discovered as well, if we look, is first of all, hand contamination. We separated between low, medium, and high contamination. And when we did that, if we look at high contamination, we discovered that if you look at total coliforms, the actual best protocol was the degreasing cream, which is a pumice that you put and you rub, and followed by the gel. If you look at the total aerobic bacterial count, it was actually soap water followed by the gel that was best. And so basically these 2 things, not only the gel, but some kind of first cleaning of the hand remains the best way of decontaminating hands. Now the boots. We did a study where we actually modified a bacteria so that it could generate ATP bioluminescence. So basically it would kind of glow in the dark, we're putting it. And so if you look in the upper left corner under the red line, you see light. You see green and blue and all that. This is because it's contaminated. And we had three protocols here that we tried. One is to change the boot as we go over the line, doing it properly. Second, not changing the boots at all. And you can see that if you do that, you have lights. It's like festivities all the way through. And this is like 10 meters, no dilution effect. And then you look at the last one on the right, and a bit less contamination, but that was the typical breach that we see on farms, and I see that all over the world. I've consulted so far in 28 countries, and essentially people would put plastic boots, or they will put the boots from the farm. They put them on, and then they put foot, their feet back exactly where they were. They do not respect the two zones. And so they contaminate the plastic boots or um, they contaminate the boots, the rubber boots. And after that, if they go in the other zone, you can see you have contamination. We wanted to also see how it would look like with a virus. So we used a phage as a proxy for any kind of virus you can think about. And what you have there, of course, that doesn't glow in the dark. And so you had the contamination level. When you did the controls, negative controls, there was no contamination at all. And then you see first, second, third, fourth, and sixth step. You can see whether it's the left foot, the right foot, you have a contamination. Now, in the lower graph, you see that there's virtually no dilution because the people didn't change their boots. And that's true for at least 10 meters. And in the middle graph here, you can see that the contamination, when you just step back exactly where you were before, the contamination of the boots is not as high, but it is there. It is present, and it is sufficient to be a problem. Now, some people would say, well, we prefer to use foot baths. You have examples of foot baths that I found in the United States in particular, but no matter where I go in the world, foot baths, foot baths in practice do not work. They're not all as contaminated as this, but most foot baths, okay, or boot dip, um, this is what you're doing, essentially. And we know that because of several studies, in particular from Cindy Amos. And this is a summary. I won't read it for you, but essentially what she's saying is, well, in practice, in theory, it works. And we have publications, in particular for Campylobacter and foot and mouth disease in ruminants and pigs. They have shown that foot baths can be useful. But they're useful if you brush your boots to remove absolutely all visible organic material first. Then you need to soak for several minutes in order to have proper decontamination. Okay. We just don't see this in practice. So that's the problem. In theory, it works. In practice, it doesn't. And so another problem is that it's often not located properly. I have a big collection from different countries. You can see whether it's in France, where is the zone? If you put first of all that when it's in a corner, you have no way of using this without going backwards and basically going back to where you were. In Mexico, same thing. You have a fence, okay, blocking you. So the principle of a foot bath, if you're going to use it, it has to be to go from one zone to another zone. So it has to be a transition, a little bit like a shower would be. Okay. Look at Cameroon. If at least it would be placed in front of the door that opens to go where the animals are. That's a problem. We have Bob Owen who did a study looking at fresh solutions of phenol, quaternary ammonium, and water, just fresh water. And you look at the percentage change in bacterial count when coming in with contaminated boots. And you can see that with the disinfectants, is actually decreasing it a bit. But a 50% reduction, it makes you go from billions of bugs to a few less billions of bugs. You're not achieving anything. And water, as you can see, actually increases your contamination. And in practice, what we found is that after 3 hours, okay, we tell people, well, change it on a daily basis, have a fresh solution. Well, after 3 hours, actually, good products, phenols, quaternary ammoniums, good products were placed in regular conditions, as we see on farms, were actually increasing the contamination of the boots. So that's an issue. Um, so they tried a dry foot bath, and that's the good news. Some people have been using foot baths for so long, okay, whether it's phenols or quats or any other product, um, that they have a very hard time to give that away, to remove this, because they are often afraid of losing credibility, because they've been saying for decades, you need to have good foot bath. And now we're saying, well, no, they actually don't work at all, or just about not. Um, so what we recommend then is try a dry foot bath with a dry bleach product. And you see, will decontaminate by over 90% and has an average residual life of several days. So if you want to maintain some kind of foot decontamination, that's what you want to do. This is an example in Burkina Faso where they decide to put that. At the very least, it doesn't hurt. Now, for those who want to maintain a wet foot bath, I saw something also in Burkina Faso that was quite interesting. And what it is, it's an immense foot bath that you cannot neglect as you're getting in. And if you can see there, they're set up to wash your hands. You have to be soaking in the foot bath. And what it does, essentially, the principle there is, as you wash your hands, at the very least, you're going to be spending as much time as possible in that foot bath. And then you have a greater chance of having an acceptable result using that. All right. Now, whatever you do, the big issue you're going to have is compliance. So compliance is the extent to which a person's behavior will coincide with the advice that the person is receiving. And it's a problem in human and veterinary medicine quite a bit. And it sucks, okay? We know it. And if you think it's good, it's probably not as good as you think. Mainly in integrated companies, I've often found upper management saying, when I say something, they do it. Well, unless you're there, you don't know that. And we actually filmed so that we could check it out, okay? So what we did, we wanted to try audits, and we wanted to try using visible cameras to say to people, you are being observed, okay? And we wanted to know the compliance level for different measures as people are getting into a building. For 2 weeks, we had cameras set up for that. And then 6 months later, did we have the same level of compliance? And of course, as I said, you have a control group where all we put was a poster saying, here are the measures, and that's it. The audit group, we had every 2 months an audit, and we had a big poster saying what to do. And the visible camera, well, had a big sign. You can see it in French there that's saying, you're being observed, please follow the rules. Now, the ethic committee told us, well, you can certainly do that, but you need to tell everybody they're being filmed, even if you want to hide a camera. And amazingly enough, they said, because I said, well, I would prefer not to tell them. They said, no, you have to tell them. But what you can do is you can put a bogus camera that you can see here. I just highlighted it, where the birds are, for example, and say we're doing a study, and we have a camera there, and you need to be aware of it. You're going to be filmed, and if you're not, if you don't want to be included in the study, then you can sign your initials there. And the employees were told that they would be filmed. What they didn't know is we had hired a technician that works for Canadian Secret Service and we said, we want you to put another camera somewhere. And he did okay. He said, we're going to have a box where we put the recording device for the bogus camera. It's the black box that you see in the left corner. And he says, I'm going to replace one of the screws there by an actually a wide angle camera. And this is what you're going to see. And so we went on 24 farms, 8 control farms, 8 audits, and 8 with visible camera group. And we did that 2 weeks and then 6 months later. So on the control farms, this is what happened. Overall, 35% compliance. Half the time people did it okay with the boots. A third of the time people signed the logbook. 70% of the time they put on the coveralls properly. Only 36% of the time they wash their hands. And the reason why it's that high is because we had about 20% of the employees who were women. Okay, women were at least twice more likely than the men to wash their hands. And this is what we see in studies in public bathroom. Okay, so this is not the kind of results we want to see to protect flocks. Keep in mind that it's human nature uh, per se. And to give you an example of that, what I just showed there is the percent compliance over months. And you see the lines there? It's for people who have breast cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular problems, hypertension, asthma, uh, problems that can be life-threatening. They are giving a set of medication, of measures, of diet change to follow. And look, after 2 to 3 months, look at the compliance level dropping to about 30, 40%. In most cases, even less over time. That's human nature. So we need to fight this. There's a way of doing that. In the case of our study, where we had about 3,000 entries and exits overall, if we look at all the 24 farms, but you look the control group, short term and medium term, about 34, as I said, 35, and then later 26% compliance. The audit, a bit higher, not significant, and did not improve. But let's keep in mind that a student was doing the audits. It was not any person in authority, because audits, I'm not saying you should not do that. Visible camera, well, at first it seemed to work, but then later it did not. And an example I can show you here is with boot compliance, where it was remarkable. 94% of people were following the rules when they had a camera in their face. But 6 months later, only 2/3 of the people were doing it. And this is why, these TV shows, reality TV works. You see people doing stupid things on camera, and you're thinking, how can they do this? Don't they realize they're being filmed? People forget over time that they are being filmed, and they just behave the way they normally do. So that's a big issue. Another point I want to highlight here is we discovered that the degree of compliance depended on the duration of the visit. Okay, so here you have the odds ratio. If it's negative, it's bad. If it's positive, it's good. So short term or medium term, the reference was a visit of less than 5 minutes. So for example, if the visit was between 5 and 17 minutes, basically people were about 7 to 13 times more at risk of doing things right, okay, of changing their boots properly. If the visit was like over an hour, over 54 minutes, mainly the first 2 weeks, they were like over 30 times more likely to do things properly. Essentially, if people are in for just like go see the grower, give him documents or something like that, or deliver something, either they think that if they go very quickly, the bugs won't have time to react and contaminate the place, which I don't think is a good perspective, or they probably think, well, this is a lot of work to change boots, put on coveralls, wash hands and all that, just for a visit of 1 minute. I'm not going to do it. So be aware of that. People who are visiting for a very short period of time are a greater risk. So why do we behave like this? There's a lot of lack of knowledge on biosecurity. Do not underestimate this. We did a training in the United States to migrant workers who had really no education, intelligent people, but didn't have education. They did not even know about vertical versus horizontal transmission of infectious diseases. Some were not aware that hand washing had any role in preventing disease transmission, even for them. So lack of knowledge is a big deal. There's obviously economic constraints to limit some of the measures, but you can still put something in places even when you have limited means. Training is a big deal. In North America, we see a lot of training of technicians and sometimes of growers. But if growers have employees, these employees don't get to go usually to training sessions. The grower says, I got the training, I'm going to train my people. But often that's not done or not done properly. That's a big issue. Communication, you'll see, not for coccidiosis, but if you think you might have Newcastle, avian influenza, or a disease you don't want to live with. For us, for example, laryngomyositis, we don't want it. Mycoplasma gallisepticum, we don't want it. We need to communicate these things and make sure people understand the importance. Having incentives is important. And now that's interesting because an incentive could be, if you don't do this, I'm going to fire you. That's what I call a negative incentive. You'll be amazed. About half the time when you ask employees if I would be able to trace back the problem, the transmission of the disease to you, okay, what would be the impact on you? 50% of the time. And that's true for other businesses. Studies have been shown on that. Employees don't know what the impact would be. That's remarkable. Okay, so people need to know, okay, this is what's important. And these are the consequences eventually if you don't do things correctly. That's one thing. But that's not sufficient. You need to think about positive incentives. And that could be to show up 1 week and tell the employees, I'm checking you out, guys. And if you do a good job, if I can see that I don't find anybody doing things improper, we're going to have, for example, a pizza lunch on Friday, or you'll be able to quit work an hour sooner on Friday, but I'll pay you anyway. It doesn't have to be very expensive, but it has to be something for them to look forward to. It could be opportunities for training, for promotion, things like that, when you need to find incentives. Lack of time is always given as a reason, but quite frankly, what is worse, the biggest problem, is the difficulty to apply measures. Like, look at this entrance. You have the door from the outside to get in, and here you have the two zones separated by a line. If you come in with 2-3 people and you have coats or stuff like that, I mean, where do you put them? How do you do things properly? You may have insects walking on either side of the line. It's very discouraging. I mean, do things properly unless you work for the Cirque du Soleil, who are from Montreal, by the way. Maybe you could do it properly, but for the most part, it's impossible. You don't have the space. And we found that in that study on the 24 farms. If you have enough space, if it's easy to do, if instead of the boot, if it's not a very tall boot, it's a small shoe that is easy to put on and remove. When you make it easy, when it's clear what is one zone, what's the next, then people will comply because you made it easy for them. Now, of course, there's all sorts of attitude, beliefs, personality. We've determined that some personality traits favor compliance versus others. I don't have time to talk about it right now, but that's something to consider sometimes if you want to hire some key individuals for an integrated company, for example, for a farm. The key thing here is the way we perceive things. And there's what we call the health belief model that comes from a study done in the United States many years ago. And what it says is that people will pay attention and will change their behavior if they're convinced of at least one or two things. The degree of susceptibility of the disease. In this case, the flock, but it could be you as a human being. If we look at the coronavirus situation in humans right now, do you really believe you're susceptible to that disease? Okay. If you're in my age group, and if you have diabetes, if you have asthma, you bet you're susceptible, and you should think you're susceptible. And then there's the degree of disability. If I do get the coronavirus, am I going to go through it like a teenager who may not even realize it? Or am I going to get so sick that I might actually die? So if you can actually convince people that some key diseases we're trying to eradicate or not have on farms in your region will cause like that the farm, your site of production is at risk, you're susceptible. And if it happens, you're going to have a great degree of disability. There's going to be consequences. Well, then you're going to get a zone of compliance. People are going to say, wow, better pay attention because this is serious. We believe it, okay? So what we want to do then is to put in place biosecurity measures, interventions that will convince people that this is what it's going to do. It's going to reduce your susceptibility and the disability. You're more likely to keep your job because we'll stay in production. Then you increase that zone of compliance. So how do we achieve that? First of all, buy-in. We often say you don't want to reinvent the wheel. Well, when it comes to biosecurity, you want to reinvent the wheel with the employees. You may have a plan, you may have it all, that's fine. If you have it all, why not review it with the employees? Ask them if they have anything to add, suggestions how to do it better. If you do that, it becomes their plan. They buy into it. They're more likely to respect a plan that comes from them than something that would come from a guy like me with a strange accent coming from who knows where and then leaving, okay? So you need to get the local people to pay attention. They need to be trained. As I said, they need proper incentive. You need to have a realistic game plan. I'll give you just one quick example. When we had foot and mouth disease in England in 2000, where they thought in the United States they might have it as well, or they were at risk. And so some places where they had animal at risk, they decided that if you would be going to England, coming back, you could not go on their farm for a week. Another company felt, well, we're better than them. We'll make it 2 weeks. And there's a third company who says, well, we're going to make it 3 weeks. When you do that, what people will do, instead of telling you the truth, they're going to lie. They're not going to tell you they've been there. And so, for example, in this case, what Eric Gunder recommended said, well, you're going to be in a zone where you have that disease, arrange to come back on a Friday to home so that you have the weekend to change clothing, change shoes, take a couple of showers. Then you come to work, and depending on the situation, the kind of exposure we think you had, maybe we'll have you work a couple of days without being in contact with the animals, and then you can move on because we feel this is safe. This is the kind of measures that people can live with. 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it's crazy. Making it easy. Markers that could be clothing, the color of clothing, color of boots, that should be in one zone and not the next. Ways of being able to see. And technology, I don't have time to talk about it. We're developing ways of improving compliance through technology. But if I go back to the hand washing, look at this. We asked the employees, the 38 or 40 employees, which protocols they liked the most. And the one they liked the most was just the gel or soap and water in the gel. And look at the degreasing cream. The degreasing cream technically is good when you use it with a gel, except that people hated it. It's at first it's kind of a bad feeling. It's gluey. It's just disgusting. They didn't like it, and so it may be a good product, but it's not something you want to use. And the other thing is, half of the employees were from Guatemala. They were from warm countries because I'm from the north, and they told us, they say, and by the way, your water better not be cold like the way it's cold in winter in Canada. where the temperature may be 4 degrees of the water. Because if it's that cold, it will hurt, and we're not going to do it. So that's what I mean, that we need to make it easy and friendly for them. I'm going to finish a couple of slides with the regional perspective. What you're looking at here is a picture taken when it was minus 35 Celsius. And when it's that cold, the air is extremely dense. And you can see basically like low clouds, that's humidity going from one farm to the next. And you have 3 farms there. Business-wise, in terms of accounting, you have 3 farms. The problem is that nature does not care about accounting, okay? All that nature sees here, epidemiologically, is one big, fat, juicy site. All these farms are so close to one another that they share an environment. They share flies, rats. They share potentially even equipment. They share people. They share the wind at proximity. All of that means that epidemiologically, biologically, this is one big site. Accounting and biology are 2 different things. That's why when you have high farm density, you cannot just focus on farm biosecurity. In Georgia and United States, when they have ILT, they're using GPS, geographic information systems, for disease surveillance and control. And you see in the lower right, left corner, they use it to decide how they're going to move birds from the production site to the slaughter plant, for example. Or they use it to map out where they're going to vaccinate or not. But this, if they do that when they have an outbreak, when they don't have outbreaks of an important disease, they still use that technology and that approach to determine how can we avoid passing by with a flock on a truck, passing by sites where you might have close to the road birds at risk, for example. And that requires stalking, because sometimes you could say, well, you can pass by it because anyway, there's no birds at risk. We're all out, okay? So what they've discovered in some areas in the United States of high farm densities is that they may be competitors, but ultimately, if they don't really want to know if one has more coccidiosis than the other, that's irrelevant. But if they want to make sure that nobody gets ILT, avian influenza, Newcastle, Mycoplasma gallisepticum, Mycoplasma synoviae, these bugs, they better start talking and work together. You don't need to love one another for that, but you need to interact in some regions and say, okay, what can we do to manage people, equipment, transportation, and all that, so that we can have lesser risks. And sometimes they will use the technology like Google Earth to look at different sites and discuss and say, okay, how are we going to deal with a situation? That's what we talk, communicating, organizing as regional biosecurity. It doesn't have to be high tech like that as well. Here's an example from Goldsboro Milling in North Carolina. They have what they call the pink screw. So they did that, and at first the growers didn't like it. They said to a grower, we're going to give you a laminated sheet with a plus, and our technicians will have one as well. And if we have any suspicion, the birds look at us funny, okay? We don't need to have more than that. We may put a plus there because over the next day or two, we want to investigate to figure out if there's something going on. The beauty of this is that instantly, automatically, you can communicate with a lot of people. Anybody who's about to go there, for example, the person delivering feed may say, oh, there's a plus there. I still need to deliver the feed. But after that, I'll need to go and decontaminate the vehicle because I've been on a site where there's at least suspicion. And this company has a series of people who are being contacted just in case. And 9 times out of 10, at the very least, it comes out to nothing. The only problem they had with that, at first, the growers didn't like it because they say, You know, it's as if you would put a plus on my forehead because I have a sexually transmitted diseases, for example. You know, it's shameful. But they discovered, first of all, that you know, you can use any kind of code that you know, people who are not in the business won't know what it is, first of all. And second of all, they discovered that they were less bothered by traveling salesmen and people like that when they had that, to a point that some wanted to leave it permanently at the entrance of their farm. So they had to tell them, no, this is not how it works. This is an example of very low tech, quick regional communication regarding potential disease presence, infectious disease presence. So there are other examples that we can certainly come up with. So ultimately, what we're talking about is that before we would have individual farm measures, traffic flow, no consideration, the way older buildings are set up, you can tell that they really didn't look at infectious diseases as being that much of a big deal. And certainly nobody wants to communicate because we always feel that there could be bad consequences. Well, the present and the future now is into integrated measures, managed traffic flow, at least on farm, and if possible in some regions as well. That requires good communication and, of course, emphasis on compliance. So we need to reduce, we need to separate, and we need, in some cases, to communicate. So I'm going to leave you with these keywords for the on-farm issues: reduction and separation. Reduction, well, you need to invest a bit. Sometimes when things are broken, it becomes difficult to clean and decontaminate. You need to audit, you need to test, look at it, at least visually, repair, brush, remove as much as possible, clean, disinfect, and then check again. And perseverance is very important. Separation, well, first reach the right people, and that is the employee doing the most minimal job. That person needs to be informed. You need to keep it simple for these people, make it easy, having the proper design so that it's easy to do what is recommended. You need to lead by example. I've been on farms in the United States where you have an integrated system, and upper management didn't feel that they had to take a shower to go on farms because they said, we know where we're coming from. That's ridiculous. You have no idea if you've been exposed, first of all. And second, when employees see this, their reaction is to say, you know, if this is not needed for you, I'm not dirtier than you are. And so that's, you need to lead. Audit, proper audits, and provide feedback. That's very important. Having a feedback, if it can be as quickly as possible, when somebody does something that's not appropriate, that's good. That's when you get the best result. Proper training, getting people involved, buying, and accept change, because things are changing. As you know, with human coronavirus right now, we're going to not go back to any kind of normal situation that we had before. Things are changing. We need to accept that and say instead, how can I do better in that environment of change? With that, I thank you.
Hi, Doctor. Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you for your time and valuable input on the key issues of biosecurity, which is the most relevant issue in the current circumstances we are in today. You have certainly given the attendees a key take-home message and practical tips that they can apply.
Appreciate it.
Pleasure. I really enjoyed your talk when you said, I'm glad to hear women are more compliant with washing their hands.
Yes. Oh yeah. I mean, we cannot. You know, this data does not lie. Do not lie, and there's plenty of evidence. Now, some of it is the nature of the person. Some of it is personality. There's several factors to consider, but for the most part, women are more likely when it comes to decontamination, more likely to do it right. And so just need to accept it. And it's a challenge to men. to say you should be as good as women. There's no reason why we should not be as good as women when it comes to things like that.
Yeah, I hope the men are listening. Anyway, if you have any questions, please use the comment section to put your questions in for Dr. Vaillancourt. Also, again, a big thank you to our sponsor Fibro. Remember to apply for your CPD certificates by completing the CPD form on the homepage. The code you can use is Fibro224, and that's a capital P. If you have any inquiries, please send us an email to support@betlink.co.za. Thank you, everyone.